Hello, my name is Pippa Hughes and I'm just going to read you a small segment of my book called Margaret. A sniff came from the far end of the Briggs behind the steps. Thomas paused, realising he was not alone on the port side of the stores below deck. Since the sleeping quarters were at the rear of the ship, a twang of adrenaline hit Thomas. He turned, walking slowly past the barrels of ale towards the Briggs, filled intensely with angst. As he silently peered around the back of the damp steps, he noticed a girl, sat almost unconscious and tied brutally to the corner of the Briggs, her light brunette hair tangled and crusted in blood over her round face. Thomas was unsure if she was alive, but was certain a woman on board was the reason behind the karmic dreadful storm they had so narrowly escaped. He frowned in uncertainty. Margaret's eyes flickered as she looked up at Thomas standing over her. Pain soared through her skull, forcing her to rest her eyes on his feet. Thomas knelt down and looked at her, the first woman he had seen so close besides his own mother. He noticed her expensive dress covered in mud, blood and urine. Blood trickled to the left of her lips as the filthy material covering her mouth ripped into her delicately pale skin. The ship had been sailing for 2 days, and Thomas wondered if she'd eaten or drank anything at all. Her eyes eventually rested on his, a sharp green. They looked almost reptile-like and seemed to calm Thomas's heart rate back to normal. Yet a growing sound of voices and footsteps dawned over the roof of the stores. Thomas couldn't move his eyes from this female figure lying almost lifeless in front of him, yet it soon became more than clear somebody was coming, snapping him out of his infatuated glare. He had left it far too late to escape the stores as the heavy footsteps reached the top of the steps, so he silently leapt for the barrels and took position behind them, his heart racing 10 times the usual speed as he was eager to avoid detection. 2 tall, wide and seemingly terrifying men headed directly for the girl, yet the strobes of moonlight hid their true features, making it impossible for Thomas to grasp who could possibly be jeopardising the voyage for the entire crew. Yet the first large man walked straight past the almost lifeless girl, looking intensely around the brig adjacent. "She's not here," he loudly whispered, Thomas still fighting the light to catch a glimpse of him. The second man stopped at Margaret's feet and spat in the direction of the first man. "She's here, all right." He spoke without a whisper, as if unafraid of any consequence or detection, and began untying her. Margaret regained further consciousness and winced in fear as the men began to push her between them in a game of tennis, pulling at her dress and laughing like overgrown schoolboys. Margaret's sharp green eyes caught the moonlight as she was tossed forcefully across the room. A sense of helplessness and misunderstanding hit Thomas. This seemed no ordinary woman of the streets. She was unaware of the fate growing closer to her as the men looked on in lust. Thomas darted lightly for the steps and leapt elegantly 2 at a time as fast as his young legs could take him, as lightly and soundlessly as possible, across the deck and up to the captain's cabin. He knocked loudly and desperately, unsure how long he had before Margaret would be devoured. There was no reply. The cabin was empty. Thomas frantically searched the cabin before his eyes rested on the Catholic metallic cross of expensive swords standing honourably within the deck just outside of the cabin, a sign of devotion to God for protection on their voyage. This seemed a perfectly reasonable need for protection as Thomas gripped one of the swords and pulled it out sharply from the decking with all his strength. It swung behind him forcefully from the sheer weight of it. Shocked at the power in his little hands, the strength he would need to use it, Thomas wasted no time in dragging it down the steps and swinging it in front of him, ready for battle. But he slipped on the lowest step to the stores and gathered his balance again, gripping the large sword with all of his presence. The ship turned to the right and the moonlight shone down the steps and over the 2 men. Robert and Arthur Smith, ex-prisoners and capable of murder should it suit them. Thomas sunk in his own skin as he realised the heroic battle he'd set himself on was one of sure fatality on his side. The Smith brothers smirked at the effort of a young apprentice standing sheepishly small with an oversized sword and clearly no ability to use it. Robert ignored the small boy and grabbed Margaret by her face, kissing her violently and throwing her across the room for his own entertainment, looking back eagerly to see Thomas's reaction. Margaret's left leg ripped open from top to bottom as she fell over splinters poking up from the ship, her delicate skin bursting open like a lily in the sunshine. Thomas looked on in shock, unable to move or think fast enough as Arthur pulled her up and dragged a kiss out from her ruined lips before ripping her beautifully detailed dress in overexcitement. A wave of anger raged inside of Thomas. And despite having never used a sword before, unable to direct it as intended, he hurled himself at Arthur first, swinging the sword in a circle, hoping it would catch him. Arthur dodged his aim and laughed at the pathetic attempt of a teenage boy at rescuing a toy intended for them. Thomas felt yet more anger rage under his skin and swung the sword around aggressively, catching Margaret's underskirt and cutting a chunk from it, narrowly missing her already sliced skin. Both ex-prisoners laughed at him further. Thomas had become double the entertainment for the brothers. They knew either way they would have Margaret, and to get to watch little Thomas kill himself with such a weapon in the meantime. Robert couldn't think of a better way to spend their evening. He sat down on the floor smiling, ready for the show, resting his elbows on his knees. Thomas's rage built further as he screamed in frustration and ran towards Robert's mocking glare. Arthur put his right foot out and tripped up Thomas, sending him flying to the other side of the room, and the sword shot directly into a barrel of ale, splitting it and spilling the contents. Margaret watched on, gathering strength at the inspirational sight of a young soul fighting for his life and hers. But Thomas, unscathed, jumped back up and grabbed the sword. He ran back towards Arthur this time, but Robert caught his hand and twisted it behind him, knocking the sword from his grip and pulled him towards the Briggs. Arthur watched on, smiling at his brother's skillfulness. The Smith brothers tied Thomas up inside the Briggs, looking towards Margaret to ensure he would witness the horrific events the night was destined to inflict on her. I'm going to leave it there. We're on 6.5 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening.